The days of there being only one possible way to do things went by the wayside about the time we moved from DOS to actual Windows, including the availability of things like menus and toolbars and keyboard shortcuts and even right clicks. Of course, this made us a little bit spoiled. Following through with our pursuit of consistency and efficiency as we work in Excel, we now expect, or maybe we should say realize, that there may be more than one possible way that we want to format parts of our worksheets, and these might be based on the value of individual cells. But we also probably realize that doing so one cell at a time is both cumbersome and inefficient, as well as increasing the likelihood of errors. In this case, that we might simply miss something and not format it appropriately. While conditional formatting isn't exclusively a feature for multiple worksheets or external data, it bears mentioning because multiple worksheets are generally associated with larger amounts of data. The more data that we have, the more difficult it is to properly manage all of that data. So while conditional formatting is not specific to multiple worksheets, it is another feature we should keep in mind as we work to optimize our data while simplifying the efforts required to get there. In our Formatting Multiple Worksheets file, we may actually find several places where conditional formatting could be used. Let's focus on just one, though. If we take a look all the way over at the right side of our worksheet, we see, of course, that we have the Annual Totals column in column O. For demonstration purposes, we tend to keep our sample files simple, so that we can keep an eye on the forest while we work with specific individual trees, if you will. So our budgets here have a limited number of line items or rows. Imagine, though, that this was actually a budget for a large company. It could also be a department within a company or maybe even your own household budget, but generally they will have more line items than we see here. All of the things that we'll talk about, though, will still apply, regardless of the actual amount of data that we have. In those cases, though, keeping track of the amount spent for various items is not only important, but actually could be a critical component of our work or our personal lives. Let's say, for example, that in this particular company, we have a policy that states if any account spends more than $1,500 in a year, it must be approved by a first-level manager. In addition, if annual expenditures exceed $10,000, then executive approval is required. While we certainly wouldn't have too much difficulty monitoring this for the number of locations and the 9 small line items that we have represented in our sample worksheet, with more worksheets, and especially with more line items, this would become very difficult. So we're going to apply conditional formatting to the values in this column to help us visually identify if these various levels of approval need to occur. Since we want to apply this conditional formatting to the same sets of cells across multiple worksheets, it might occur to you that we should group the worksheets first. In this case, we can move to the bottom left of the screen and do a click-shift-click by clicking on the Boise tab, holding the Shift key, and clicking on the Seattle tab to select our 4 worksheets. We're not including the summary worksheet because this policy doesn't apply to the summary, only to individual locations. The summary sheet actually includes consolidated values, which is not applicable to this policy. But what I want you to notice is once we group the worksheets, if we move up to the Home tab, take a look at the Styles group, and specifically at the Conditional Formatting option, you'll see that it's grayed out. I don't have a specific answer as to why this is. Excel can do so many complicated things, but apparently, when we have grouped worksheets, the Conditional Formatting option is not available. Now you might get creative and say, well, how about if I just make a discontiguous selection? What if I select the cells on the first worksheet, go to the second worksheet and hold Control and make another selection? While you certainly can make multiple selections this way, once you apply the conditional formatting, you'll see that it only gets applied to whatever the active sheet was when you created the formats. So a little tip that I can give you is that, unfortunately, it's not going to be as simple as it could be, but we can still work with conditional formatting. We just have to do it using the Format Painter. So let's start by actually ungrouping our worksheets and making sure that the Boise worksheet is selected, as well as the relevant cells, which happen to be about O5 through O14. We need to actually apply 2 conditional formats, so we'll start with the first one first, which was anything over $1,500 should have our attention drawn to it. So with our cells selected, we'll move up to the conditional formatting option, which is now available. And I'm thinking an icon set might be nice, so I'll come down to icon sets. And let's go ahead and choose the check mark, the exclamation mark, and the red X. This applies some default settings for our conditional format, which may or may not work for us. And what I can tell you right now is it doesn't work for us. What we'd like to do is have the red X applied to anything that's above $10,000. We'd like to have the green check mark for anything that's below $1,400, and an exclamation mark for things that are in between. Since we don't want the default, what we need to do is go to the Manage Rules window so that we can customize the way this rule is applied. Manage Rules can be accessed, again, from the Conditional Formatting option in the ribbon. But this time we need to come all the way to the bottom and choose Manage Rules. We want to edit the current rule, so we'll make sure it's selected, then click or tap Edit Rule. First of all, for us, the lower numbers are good and the higher numbers are bad, or maybe we should say need attention. So we're going to click the option that says Reverse the Icon Order. Now we can work with the actual values. There are a lot of different ways to configure the different types of conditional formats, but I think they're pretty easy to figure out once we see them. First, we don't want to do this based on a percentage, but on an actual value. So we'll choose Number from the rightmost column. You actually need to do that first because it zeroes out other values that you have here. We want the red X to apply to any values that are $1,500 or higher because those are the ones that need our first level manager approval. But maybe we want our attention drawn before it actually gets to that level. So we'll move down to the second option and say, give us an exclamation mark when it gets close, maybe at $1,300. And that, of course, means that everything else will have the check mark. We can go ahead and click OK, and OK again, and we've applied our first rule. If we look carefully at our values, we can see that everything that is above our $1,500 mark has the X. Our value for $1,440 is getting pretty close, so it has the exclamation mark, and everything else has the green check mark. Now let's do the second half of our policy. We definitely want to draw different attention to values that are above that $10,000 mark. So this one's a little bit easier. We'll go back to conditional formatting, and we're going to use kind of the old-fashioned way of doing things, which is just highlight a cell value when it's greater than, and our value is $10,000. We'll say OK. And now our second rule has been applied. Let's go ahead and just click off of it so that we can see that that actually does apply to the two values that are over $10,000. We've been able to apply two different rules to the same series of cells. If necessary, we'd want to go back into the Manage Cells window and make sure that they were in the correct order or that they stopped if a certain one was found to be true. But let's get on to how this applies to multiple worksheets, and that is that we couldn't apply this to all of our worksheets at one time. Well, unfortunately, we need to kind of do this in a little bit of the old-fashioned manual way by using the Format Painter. We don't need to select all of the cells, we only need to select one of them. Move to the upper left side of the ribbon and double-click the Format Painter to lock it on. And then we'll move progressively from one worksheet to the next. We'll move over to Boston, and we can click and drag over the same series of cells. You can see that it's automatically applied. Now I know that for maybe 3 or 4 worksheets this may not be too difficult, but what if we had 100 or 1,000? That's when you might consider using a macro so that you can repeat the activity without physically having to do it yourself over and over again. It honestly doesn't matter whether you're working with a few lines on a single worksheet or thousands of lines on hundreds of worksheets. The ability to apply conditional formatting remains basically the same. It is unfortunate that we can't utilize the grouping of worksheets like we do with other things when we're working across multiple worksheets. But there is a workaround, and possibly in future versions of Excel, they'll enable this particular feature. What does increase exponentially are the benefits we see from being able to use conditional formatting within our worksheets. Excel cells don't exactly equate to trees, But if we think of it as an analogy, as the size and complexity of our data increases, our ability to monitor the status of each individual tree within the overall forest that is our workbook becomes more complicated and prone to errors. Conditional formatting is a simple way to allow Excel to flag any particular trees that may need our specific attention.